Richard Donovan had built his empire on discipline, precision, and an almost mechanical sense of time. Every meeting in his day was slotted into a carefully curated calendar, every phone call scheduled by an assistant, every handshake rehearsed with the confidence of a man who always knew what was coming next. His world was predictable, he had made sure of it. And yet, on that particular Friday afternoon, something stirred inside him. It wasn't on his calendar. There was no meeting, no memo, no reminder from his phone. It was something quieter, something human. The faint ache of loneliness and the memory of a child's laughter that had become too rare. For years, Richard had buried himself in work after the death of his wife. Losing Anna had left a hole so deep, he couldn't bear to look at it. Instead, he threw himself into late nights at the office, into boardrooms and contracts, into profit margins and investments. It was easier to face a spreadsheet than the empty chair at the dining table. Easier to talk about millions in profits than to listen to his daughter ask why mommy never came home anymore. His daughter, Emily, was 10 now. Bright, sensitive, and far wiser than her years. Richard loved her deeply, more than he could ever put into words. But he often convinced himself that his long hours and business trips were sacrifices made for her future. If I can build a stronger empire, she'll never want for anything, he told himself. But in his heart, he knew that no empire could replace the warmth of a father's presence. That afternoon, while reviewing yet another report in his office, Richard found his mind drifting. He thought of Emily sitting alone in the mansion, surrounded by tutors, caretakers, and staff who were paid to keep her entertained. He imagined her at piano practice, playing notes to an empty room, or curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for him to come home. The guilt that had been gnawing at him for years rose stronger, pressing into his chest. Before he could overthink it, Richard shut his laptop, startling his assistant. "Cancel the rest of my meetings," he said. "Sir?" The assistant blinked, confused. "Richard never canceled meetings. I said cancel them. I'll handle the fallout." His tone left no room for argument. Minutes later, Richard was walking through the underground garage, his polished shoes echoing against the marble. His driver rushed to open the car door, but Richard held up a hand. "Not today. I'll drive myself." The driver hesitated, clearly unsettled. Richard never drove himself, but something about the look in his employer's eyes made him step back silently. Sliding into the driver's seat of his sleek black sedan, Richard felt a strange thrill. It had been years since he had driven anywhere on his own. As the city skyline gave way to the long stretches of road leading toward his estate, he loosened his tie, rolled down the window, and let the late afternoon air rush against his face. For a brief moment, he wasn't Richard Donovan, the billionaire tycoon. He was just a man going home to see his daughter. The Donovan estate sat on a hill outside the city, sprawling across acres of manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. The mansion itself was a fortress of glass and stone, a symbol of his wealth and success. Normally, Richard arrived home to a staff waiting at the front door, a dinner menu already planned, and silence echoing through the grand halls. But this time, he parked quietly near the side entrance. He wanted the surprise to be genuine. He wanted to see Emily before anyone could prepare her, before the staff could coach her into polite greetings or rehearse smiles. He wanted her laughter unfiltered, her joy real. As he walked across the courtyard, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stone pathway. He expected silence. Instead, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. High, ringing, pure laughter. It floated across the air, carried by the wind, warm and alive. Richard froze, his heart tightening. It had been so long since he had heard Emily laugh like that. Not the polite giggles she gave when her tutors tried to be funny, not the soft chuckles when he bought her something expensive, but real laughter, the kind that bubbled up from the soul. Curious, he followed the sound, his footsteps soft against the stone. As he drew closer to the garden, the laughter grew louder. He slowed his pace, almost hesitant, as though afraid the sound would vanish if he moved too quickly. Then he saw them. Through the rose bushes, beneath the shade of a wide oak tree, sat Emily. Her blonde hair spilled over her shoulders, messy and loose, and her face glowed with a joy he hadn't seen in years. She was seated on a small wooden stool, leaning forward as someone worked gently on her hair. That someone was Grace, the new maid. Richard blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. Grace was young, her dark skin glowing in the sunlight, her hands moving carefully as she braided Emily's hair. She hummed a soft tune, something lilting and soothing, while Emily giggled every time a braid tickled her neck. Richard's throat tightened. He had expected to come home to an empty mansion, maybe a quiet dinner with Emily at best. But here was his daughter, radiant, joyful, alive, and it wasn't him who had made her smile. For a moment he simply stood there, hidden behind the hedge, his mind whirling. 100 questions flooded him at once. Why is the maid with Emily? Where is her nanny? Why is my daughter sitting on a stool in the garden instead of practicing piano or studying with her tutor? But underneath the questions was something else, an emotion far more raw. It was jealousy. He had spent years providing for Emily, buying her everything money could buy, and yet here she was, happier in the presence of a maid than she ever seemed with him. The sight pierced him deeper than any business failure ever could. His hand gripped the edge of the hedge, knuckles white. He wanted to step forward, to assert control, to remind Emily who her father was and remind Grace of her place in the household. And yet he couldn't move, because the truth was undeniable. This was the happiest he had seen his daughter in years. The billionaire who could bend markets with his decisions stood frozen, powerless against the laughter of his little girl. And in that moment, Richard Donovan realized that coming home unannounced might change his life in ways he never expected. Richard Donovan had always prided himself on control. Control of his business, control of his reputation, control of the image the world saw when they looked at him. His home was no different. The mansion was more than a residence, it was a symbol. Every corner was immaculate, every hedge trimmed with precision, every flower chosen to fit the perfect aesthetic of wealth and dignity. Staff followed routines like clockwork, tutors reported Emily's progress in neat charts, and the house operated like a well-oiled machine. And yet, as Richard stepped quietly through the back garden that day, he found himself in the middle of a scene that shattered the order he had so carefully constructed. He had expected silence, perhaps the faint notes of Emily's piano drifting through the windows, or the low hum of a television playing in the background. Instead, he was greeted by a sound that felt foreign in its intensity. His daughter's laughter. It came from near the old oak tree, the one Anna had once loved to sit beneath with a book in her hands. Richard's steps slowed as he approached, and when he finally peeked through the rose bushes, his breath caught in his throat. There she was, Emily, his precious little girl, seated on a simple wooden stool. Her cheeks glowed, her golden hair tumbled freely, and her blue eyes sparkled with mischief. But what stunned Richard most was not her joy, it was who was sitting behind her, fingers deftly weaving through her hair. Grace, the new maid. Richard remembered the day she had been introduced. He had barely looked at her then, too preoccupied with phone calls and contracts. To him, she was just another staff member, hired to fill a role, to maintain order in his massive home. She was quiet, efficient, and unremarkable, or so he had thought. But here, in this moment, she was anything but unremarkable. Grace sat cross-legged on the grass, her dark skin luminous in the soft light of the late afternoon, her expression gentle and patient. She hummed a tune, low and melodic, as her fingers worked skillfully to braid Emily's long hair. The song was unfamiliar, perhaps something from Grace's childhood, but it seemed to wrap around Emily like a lullaby. And Emily looked alive in a way Richard had almost forgotten. She giggled when Grace tickled her ear with a strand of hair. She leaned back trustingly against her, and she looked up at her with eyes full of unfiltered admiration. Richard's chest tightened. This was not part of the order he had created. This was not the polished, rehearsed interaction between a child and her tutor. This was raw, human, and intimate. It was the kind of bond money couldn't buy, the kind of bond Richard had unconsciously deprived his daughter of for years. At first, confusion struck him. Why was Grace here, in the garden, braiding Emily's hair as though she were a mother or a sister? Wasn't her job to keep the house in order, to manage chores, to remain invisible unless called upon? He had paid for professional nannies, elite tutors, trained caretakers. They were supposed to shape Emily, not the maid. Then came discomfort. Richard had been raised in a world where boundaries were clear, where social lines were drawn in permanent ink. He could not ignore the prejudices he carried. Though he had never spoken them aloud, they were there, inherited from a lifetime of privilege. And here was his daughter, a billionaire's child, bonding with the maid in a way that crossed every unspoken rule of status and class. But as he stood frozen, his discomfort gave way to something far more difficult to swallow. Guilt. Because the truth was undeniable. Emily was happier in this moment than she had been in months, maybe even years. Her laughter wasn't polite. It wasn't forced. It was free. And Richard, her father, the man who claimed to love her more than anything, had not been the one to bring her that joy. A lump rose in his throat as he realized he was watching a side of Emily he had long forgotten existed. She wasn't the obedient student reciting French verbs, nor the neatly dressed girl playing Chopin in an empty parlor. She wasn't the child paraded at charity events to prove what a family man Richard Donovan was. She was simply a child, carefree, mischievous, and full of life. And it was Grace, not him, who had given her the space to be that child again. Richard shifted slightly, and a branch snapped under his shoe. Grace's humming faltered, and she turned her head slightly, sensing movement. For a brief second, their eyes met through the leaves. Her gaze startled him. It wasn't fearful as he expected. It wasn't apologetic. It was steady, calm, grounded, unflinching. She didn't look at him as though he were a powerful billionaire to be obeyed. She looked at him as though she were silently challenging him. "Do you see your daughter? Do you really see her?" Richard's breath hitched, and he pulled back before Emily noticed. His heart pounded against his ribs. He wasn't used to being seen that way, not in his boardrooms, not in his social circles, not even in his own home. People usually bowed to his presence, softened their voices, flattered him. But Grace had looked at him like a man stripped of his armor, a father caught neglecting the most important part of his life. He stepped back, pressing his palm against the cold stone of the garden wall. His instincts screamed at him to regain control, to step forward and remind them both of their places. To remind Emily that she was a Donovan, not a child who needed a maid for company. To remind Grace of the invisible line she had crossed by becoming more than what her job description allowed. But his heart betrayed him, because as much as he wanted to be indignant, he could not erase the sound of Emily's laughter from his ears. He could not unsee the joy on her face. He could not deny that Grace, the woman he had dismissed as insignificant, had managed to reach his daughter in a way he had failed to for years. For the first time in a very long time, Richard Donovan felt powerless. The man who could manipulate markets with a single decision, who could bend politicians with donations, who could outwit his rivals with ease, stood frozen in his own garden, unsure of what to do. He lingered there for several minutes, watching as Grace tied the last braid with a ribbon and kissed Emily lightly on the top of her head. Emily turned, wrapping her small arms around Grace's neck with a squeal of happiness. Richard swallowed hard. That simple hug pierced him deeper than he could bear. Something was shifting inside him, though he did not yet have words for it. He only knew that the order he had built, the carefully controlled life he had designed, was beginning to unravel. And it had all begun with the unexpected sight of a maid and a child, beneath the branches of an oak tree. Richard Donovan had faced ruthless business tycoons, cutthroat competitors, and negotiations worth billions of dollars. He had stood firm when companies collapsed, when stocks plummeted, when critics sharpened their knives against him. Nothing rattled him, at least not in the world of business. But as he stood in the garden that day, half hidden behind the hedges, watching his daughter's laughter spill into the air, he realized something unsettling. He was trembling. The sight before him had disarmed him in ways he couldn't explain. On the surface, it was simple enough. A maid braiding a child's hair. Yet it hit him with the weight of a storm. First came confusion. Why was Grace, the maid, so deeply involved with Emily. Richard had hired nannies, governesses, and tutors for that exact purpose, to care for his daughter's needs, to fill the void his own absence often left. Grace was supposed to remain invisible, quietly maintaining order in the household, not bonding with his child as if she were family. Richard prided himself on structure, and this was anything but structured. Then came jealousy, sharp, unexpected, and humiliating. His chest tightened as he watched Emily lean back against Grace's lap, trusting and carefree. He had bought Emily ponies, expensive dresses, vacations in Paris, dolls imported from Italy. Yet he had never seen her glow like this in his presence. That laughter, rich, unrestrained, bubbling up from a place of pure joy, had not been directed at him for years. And it hurt. It hurt more than any hostile takeover or courtroom defeat. The pain came with a bitter whisper. "She's happier with her than she is with you." Richard shifted his weight, trying to shake off the thought, but it clung to him like a shadow. He wanted to believe it wasn't true. He wanted to tell himself that Emily loved him above all else. And she did love him, he knew that. But love was not the same as joy, and joy was what he saw in her now. And then, worse than the jealousy, came the discomfort. Richard had been raised in a world where lines were drawn sharply, and people knew their place. The wealthy dined at one table. The staff served at another. The wealthy children were tutored by professionals, while the children of the staff played outside the gates. It was the way things were, the way they had always been. Though Richard considered himself modern, progressive even, he could not deny the quiet prejudices that lingered deep inside him. He had never said them aloud, but they were there, inherited from his upbringing and reinforced by the society around him. And here was Grace, a black maid, her hands in his daughter's golden hair, her presence blurring a line Richard had never expected to see blurred. He wanted to tell himself that he wasn't that kind of man. That skin color didn't matter, that status didn't define worth. And in many ways, he believed that. He employed a diverse staff, he donated to charities that championed equality. He spoke publicly about opportunity for all. But belief and reality were two different things. Belief was easy when it stayed abstract, distant. Reality was harder when it appeared in your own backyard, braided into your daughter's hair. And beneath the confusion, the jealousy, and the discomfort, there was something else, something heavier. Guilt. It landed on him like a stone in his chest. Because as much as he wanted to resist the image, to dismiss it as inappropriate or unprofessional, he could not deny the truth. His daughter was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy, and it wasn't because of him. That realization burned. Richard prided himself on being a provider, a protector. Since Anna's death, he had convinced himself that the long hours, the sleepless nights, the endless business trips, all of it was for Emily. He told himself he was building a future where she would never lack anything. Yet standing there, listening to her laughter, he realized he had been wrong. It wasn't the mansion or the expensive toys or the elite tutors that lit up Emily's face. It was the simple act of being seen, of being cared for, of having someone who listened and played with her without agenda. Grace, with no riches, no power, no polished pedigree, had given Emily something Richard couldn't, her humanity. His stomach twisted. A voice inside him whispered, "You've failed her." He clenched his jaw, fighting the thought. He wanted to reject it, to bury it under excuses. He told himself he was doing his best, that Emily was still young, that there was time to repair things. But the longer he stood there, the harder it became to believe his own justifications. The flood of emotions threatened to drown him. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the life he had built crack beneath his feet. Part of him wanted to march forward, to end the scene immediately, to remind Grace of her position, to reassert his authority, to pull Emily into his arms and declare that he was the only one who should matter. That was the instinct of Richard Donovan, the billionaire, the man who commanded respect and never lost control. But another part of him, quieter and more vulnerable, told him to stop, to stay hidden, to keep watching, to let this moment unfold without interference. Because deep down, he knew that if he ended it now, it wasn't Grace he'd be robbing Emily of. It was Emily herself, and that truth terrified him. For years, Richard had believed that wealth gave him power over everything. Over his business, over his future, over the lives of those around him. But here, in his own garden, he realized the most humbling truth of all. His money could not buy his daughter's laughter. It was a shattering realization, one that left him unsteady on his feet. He was a man who owned skyscrapers, fleets of cars, entire companies. Yet in that moment he felt smaller than ever. A father, standing on the outside of his daughter's world. Peering in, the laughter rang out again, cutting through his chest like sunlight through a storm cloud. Emily threw her arms around Grace's neck, whispering something that Richard couldn't hear, but could see etched in the tenderness of her face. And Richard, hidden in the shadows, swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He didn't feel like a tycoon or a powerful man, or even a provider. He felt like what he truly was in that moment, just a father. A father who was realizing painfully and beautifully that love was not measured in fortunes but in presence. And that sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who step in to give our children what we cannot. Richard stood there, silent and still, as the flood of emotions washed over him. Confusion, jealousy, discomfort, guilt, and beneath it all something new, an awakening. He didn't yet know what he would do, or how he would reconcile the storm raging inside him. But he knew this: the world he had so carefully controlled was no longer the same. And it had all changed with a single unexpected sound: his daughter's laughter. Richard stood frozen behind the hedge, his polished shoes rooted to the earth as if invisible chains held him there. He had been trying to retreat, to compose himself before Emily noticed, but fate had other plans. "Daddy!" The single word rang out like a bell, sharp and joyous, cutting through the garden air. Emily had spotted him. She leapt from her little stool, braids half-finished and uneven, ribbons dangling loosely from Grace's careful fingers. Her laughter spilled again as she dashed across the grass, her bare feet carrying her swiftly toward him. Richard's chest tightened. He had been unprepared for her to see him like this, standing awkwardly, caught between the role of father and the mask of the billionaire. But all that fell away as Emily barreled into his legs, wrapping her arms tightly around him. "Daddy, look!" she cried breathlessly, her words tumbling out with excitement. She leaned back to tilt her face up toward him, her eyes glowing with unrestrained joy. "Grace is making me look like a princess." Richard blinked down at her. A ribbon of golden hair fell into her face, half braided, the other side wild and free. It was uneven, imperfect, and yet Emily wore it like a crown. She looked radiant, her happiness radiating from her like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a long moment, Richard couldn't speak. He felt the weight of her small arms, the warmth of her laughter, the innocence in her eyes. And with it came a sting of shame. He had spent so much of his life in boardrooms and conference calls, telling himself it was all for her future. But here she was, showing him so plainly that what she wanted most wasn't another toy or another tutor. It was simple, unfiltered love. Behind her, Grace rose quietly from the grass. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She simply stood with her hands clasped gently in front of her, waiting respectfully. But her presence lingered like a silent echo, reminding Richard of the truth he wanted so desperately to ignore. It was Grace who had given Emily this moment of joy, not him. "Do you like it, Daddy?" Emily asked, spinning once so the uneven braids bounced around her shoulders. Her eyes sparkled, full of pride. Richard forced a smile, his voice hoarse. "Yes, sweetheart. You look beautiful." Emily squealed happily and turned back toward Grace. "See, I told you Daddy would love it." Grace gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. There was no arrogance in her face, no triumph in having won Emily's affection. Only quiet kindness, a humility that made Richard's chest ache all the more. Emily tugged his hand eagerly. "Come sit with us, Daddy. Grace is going to finish the braids, and then I'm going to be the princess of the garden. You can be the king." Richard hesitated. The idea felt foreign, almost absurd. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat on the grass, let alone played pretend. His days were filled with business strategy, financial forecasts, contracts and mergers, not tiaras and fairy tales. He opened his mouth to protest, to tell Emily he had to get changed, that he was too tired, that he had work to finish. But then he saw her face, that hopeful, innocent expression, that wide, trusting smile that carried no doubt, no hesitation. She wasn't asking for money or gifts or promises. She was asking for him, and how could he deny her? Richard let out a slow breath and allowed himself to be pulled forward. Emily led him across the grass back toward the oak tree, her small hand warm in his. Grace stepped back as they approached, lowering her gaze as if giving them space. But Emily would not have it. "No, Grace, stay," she insisted, her voice clear and commanding in a way only a child's could be. "You have to finish my braids, remember?" Richard's jaw tightened. Part of him wanted to dismiss the idea, to tell Grace she could leave, that he could handle his daughter. But another part of him, the part that had been cracked open by the sound of Emily's laughter, stayed silent. So he sat. The billionaire, always so immaculate, lowered himself onto the soft grass beneath the oak tree. Emily climbed back onto her little stool, bouncing with excitement. Grace knelt behind her, her movements steady and graceful, picking up the braid she had left unfinished. Richard watched. It was a simple act, fingers weaving strands of hair, ribbons tied with care, but there was something almost sacred about it. Grace hummed softly as she worked, her voice low and soothing. Emily swayed gently to the rhythm, her eyes fluttering shut in contentment. "Doesn't it feel nice, Daddy?" Emily said, tilting her head slightly. Richard swallowed. "Yes, sweetheart. It looks very nice." Emily grinned, utterly oblivious to the turmoil storming inside her father's chest. She only knew that she was happy, and that was enough. As Richard sat there, he couldn't help but notice how natural it all felt for Emily. How she treated Grace not as staff, not as someone beneath her, but as a friend. Children had no filters, no prejudice, no sense of the rigid boundaries adults clung to. To Emily, kindness was enough. Love was enough. And in that innocence, she saw what Richard himself had been blind to. The child's joy was pure, uncalculated. It wasn't weighed against social standing, money, or appearances. It wasn't hindered by pride or fear of judgment. Emily didn't care that Grace was the maid. She didn't care about her skin color, her status, or her role in the household. She only cared that Grace listened to her, played with her, and treated her with love. And that innocence cut Richard to his core, because it revealed, in the simplest way, how far he had drifted from the truth. He had been so consumed by maintaining control, by upholding appearances, by protecting the image of the Donovan family, that he had forgotten the purity of love stripped of conditions. He felt Emily's small hand slip into his, and he tightened his grip gently. Her head leaned against his arm as Grace tied the last braid with a ribbon. "All done," Grace said softly, her voice respectful but warm. Emily clapped her hands. "Thank you, Grace. Daddy, can we take a picture? Please, please, please? I want you to remember me like this forever." Richard's throat tightened. She said it so innocently, so matter-of-factly, not knowing how deeply her words pierced him. He realized then that he hadn't truly seen his daughter in a long time. Not like this. Not in her purest, happiest form. "Yes," he managed, his voice rough. "Let's take a picture." Grace stepped back, giving them space, and Richard lifted his phone. Emily leaned close to him, her half-finished braids falling over her shoulders, her face glowing with laughter. He snapped the photo, and for the first time in years he felt something inside him stir. Not the satisfaction of a deal closed, not the pride of an empire expanding, but something far simpler, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in too long. Joy. And it was his daughter's innocent joy that gave it back to him. Dinner that evening was quiet, at least on the surface. The dining hall, with its polished mahogany table stretching nearly 20 feet, gleamed beneath the chandelier's golden light. The staff moved in hushed efficiency, serving roasted lamb, glazed vegetables, and fine wine. Emily sat beside Richard, still glowing from her afternoon joy, her braids bouncing unevenly as she spoke about the princess games she and Grace had played. Richard listened, nodding at intervals, but his mind wasn't in the conversation. He smiled at Emily when she looked his way, but every word she spoke was a reminder of what he had witnessed in the garden. He couldn't shake the image. Grace's fingers weaving through his daughter's hair, his daughter's laughter bubbling like music. It had stirred emotions he hadn't fully processed. And now, sitting across from Grace as she quietly served water, those emotions hardened into something sharper. When Emily finally skipped off to her room for bedtime, kissing him on the cheek with a cheerful, "Good night, Daddy. Good night, Grace," the house seemed to grow still. Richard waited until the echo of her footsteps disappeared up the grand staircase. Then he looked at Grace. "Join me in my study," he said, his voice measured but firm. Grace hesitated for only a second, her eyes flickering with something unreadable, before she nodded. "Yes, sir." The study was Richard's sanctuary, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather-bound volumes that he rarely touched but displayed proudly. The scent of aged paper and cedar wood filled the air, and the fire crackled in the hearth. Richard stood by the window, his back to the door, staring into the garden beyond as Grace stepped inside. He didn't turn at first. Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally he spoke. "Close the door." She did. He took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders before turning to face her. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, the way they often were in the boardroom when he prepared to dismantle an opponent's argument. "I want to make something clear," he began, his tone cool. "You were hired to maintain this household, to clean, to manage chores, to ensure the order of this home is kept. Nothing more." Grace's hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture respectful. She said nothing, waiting. Richard continued, his voice tightening. "I pay for tutors, for nannies, for professionals trained to handle my daughter's needs. I did not hire you to play games with her, to braid her hair, to blur lines that should remain clear." He expected her to lower her eyes, to apologize, to retreat into silence the way most of his employees did when confronted. But Grace did not flinch. Her gaze lifted, steady and calm, her voice even but strong. "With all due respect, sir," she said, "Emily doesn't just need tutors or caretakers. She needs someone who sees her." Richard's jaw tightened. "I see her." Grace's eyes softened, but her words carried weight. "Do you?" The question struck him like a blade. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a man who always had answers, who commanded entire boardrooms with his eloquence, the silence was jarring. Grace stepped forward slightly, her voice steady but never disrespectful. "Sir, I clean the floors, I wash the windows, I fold the linens. That is my job, yes. But when I see a little girl sitting alone under a tree with no one to laugh with, I cannot walk away. I cannot ignore her loneliness. Because no child, especially one who has already lost so much, deserves to feel invisible in her own home." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. His instinct was to reassert control, to remind her of her place, to protect the fragile walls of authority he had built around himself. But the truth in her voice cracked those walls like glass. "You're overstepping," he said, his tone sharper now, more defensive than authoritative. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply met his gaze and said softly, "Sometimes caring for a child means overstepping." The room fell into silence again, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides, not in anger at her, but in anger at himself, for not having the courage to face the reality she had just spoken aloud. For a long moment he studied her. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't insolent. She was simply honest. There was no malice in her expression, only a quiet conviction that came from love. A love he had not been giving Emily, though he had convinced himself otherwise. Richard turned back toward the window, his reflection faintly visible against the glass. He saw not the powerful billionaire he presented to the world, but a man confronted with his own failures. A man who had been hiding behind wealth and status while his daughter sought connection elsewhere. "You speak boldly," he said finally, his voice low. Grace inclined her head slightly. "I speak truthfully. If that offends you, I apologize. But Emily matters more to me than offending you." That statement disarmed him completely. He wasn't used to employees speaking with such conviction. He wasn't used to being told truths that stripped him bare. And most of all, he wasn't used to realizing that the person he dismissed as just the maid had seen his daughter more clearly than he had. The weight of it was suffocating. He wanted to lash out, to dismiss her, to end the conversation. But deep inside, he knew that would be cowardice. So instead, Richard did something rare. He fell silent. Grace took that silence as her cue to bow her head respectfully. "Thank you for hearing me, sir," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Her footsteps echoed across the study floor, and as the door clicked shut behind her, Richard felt the air leave his lungs in a heavy sigh. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, his hands gripping the armrests as though he needed them to keep steady. His mind replayed her words, each one a weight pressing into his chest. Emily doesn't just need tutors or caretakers. She needs someone who sees her. He had thought he was doing enough. He had thought that building an empire was the ultimate act of love. But Grace had forced him to face the truth. He had given Emily everything, except himself. And now, the quiet dignity of a maid had dismantled the illusion he had built for years. For the first time in a long time, Richard Donovan didn't feel like the man in control. He felt like a father who had failed his daughter. And the realization terrified him. That night, sleep would not come to Richard Donovan. The mansion was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The rhythmic chimes felt louder than usual, slicing the stillness with reminders of the passing time. Richard lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his body weary but his mind restless, turning over every word Grace had spoken in his study. Emily doesn't just need tutors or caretakers. She needs someone who sees her. He had tried to dismiss it at first, tried to tell himself that Grace was overstepping, that she didn't understand the life of wealth and responsibility he carried on his shoulders. But the truth was like a thorn embedded deep in his chest. It didn't matter how he shifted, it would not stop pricking him. At 2 a.m, Richard finally gave up on sleep. He swung his legs out of bed and padded quietly into his study. The fire had long died, leaving only faint embers glowing in the ashes. He didn't light it again. Instead, he sat heavily in the leather chair, elbows on his knees, his hands pressed to his face. The silence of the house reminded him how empty it often was. Endless rooms, immaculate floors, expensive art on the walls, all symbols of success. But what did it mean if the laughter of his daughter echoed through them only when someone else, not him, was by her side? Richard thought back to his own childhood. His father, too, had been a man consumed by work. He remembered birthdays celebrated with gifts but not with presents. He remembered dinners where his mother filled the silence his father left behind. He remembered the hollow ache of longing for someone too busy building a fortune to notice the boy sitting across the table. He had promised himself he would never become that man. Yet here he was, years later, repeating the same mistakes with his own child. The realization stung. Richard stood and walked toward the window, his eyes drawn to the garden below. The same garden where Grace had been weaving braids into Emily's hair that afternoon. He could almost hear Emily's laughter again, light and unrestrained. That sound, so pure, so innocent, wasn't something money could buy. He thought of Grace's words once more. Sometimes caring for a child means overstepping. Overstepping. That was what terrified him, wasn't it? Not the act itself, but what it revealed, that someone outside his perfect, controlled world could do something he couldn't. That Grace, just a maid, had been able to give Emily something he hadn't managed to, presence. Love in its simplest, most human form. The thought humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. For decades, he had defined strength as power, authority, control. But Grace's strength looked different. It was quiet, patient, unshakable. It came from kindness, from seeing Emily not as an obligation, not as a line item in a schedule, but as a child desperate for connection. And Richard, her father, had missed it. He lowered his head into his hands again, this time not as a businessman burdened by responsibility, but as a man confronting his failures. The following morning, Richard was up earlier than usual. He sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee steaming in front of him, waiting for Emily. When she padded down the stairs in her pink pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her face lit up in surprise. "Daddy, you're here in the morning." The joy in her voice cut him deeply. Something so small, his presence at breakfast, was a rare event for her. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly, pulling her into his lap. "I thought I'd join you today." She grinned, snuggling against him. "Grace usually eats with me." Richard glanced up, and there she was, Grace, standing discreetly near the doorway with a tray of toast and fruit. Her expression was composed, but he thought he saw the faintest flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Grace," Richard said carefully, "would you join us?" Her brows lifted slightly in surprise, but she nodded. "If you wish, sir." The three of them sat together at the long table, an unlikely trio. Emily chattered about her dreams, her dolls, and how she wanted to learn to ride a bicycle. Richard listened, really listened, responding with genuine interest. Each word reminded him how much he had been missing, how many mornings had slipped away unnoticed. When Emily skipped off to get dressed for school, Richard turned to Grace. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "You were right." Grace blinked. "Sir, about Emily, about me." He exhaled slowly, as though forcing the words past a barrier he had built for years. "I thought giving her everything money could buy would be enough. But it wasn't. She doesn't need more things. She needs me, and I've failed her." Grace's gaze softened, but she didn't rush to comfort him. Instead, she let the silence stretch, giving his confession space to breathe. "Failure isn't final, sir," she said gently. "It's only final if you refuse to change." The words sank deep. They weren't judgmental, nor were they flattering. They were simply true. For the first time in years, Richard felt something stirring inside him. A desire not just to provide, but to be present. To not only build an empire, but to build memories with his daughter. It frightened him, but it also freed him. That evening, Richard came home early, another rarity. He found Emily in the playroom, dolls spread across the floor, Grace folding laundry nearby. "Daddy!" Emily exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "Come play." Richard hesitated at the doorway, uncomfortable in a world of tiny plastic figurines and make-believe. But then he remembered Grace's words. Sometimes caring for a child means overstepping, so he stepped in. He sat cross-legged on the floor, awkwardly at first, taking the doll Emily handed him. "Okay," she said, eyes bright with excitement. "You're the prince, and I'm the princess. Grace is the queen." Richard glanced at Grace, who looked down with a small smile as she continued folding. He cleared his throat. "Very well. What does the prince do?" Emily giggled. "He saves the princess, of course." And so Richard, billionaire and boardroom conqueror, pretended to fight invisible dragons and rescue his daughter, her laughter ringing through the house like music. Grace watched quietly, her heart full, knowing she had just witnessed the beginning of something long overdue. A father rediscovering his role not as a provider, but as a parent. That night, as Richard tucked Emily into bed, something he hadn't done in years, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. Today was the best day ever." Tears pricked his eyes, but he forced a steady smile. "Mine too, Emily. Mine too." When he closed her door and walked down the hallway, he felt lighter than he had in decades. Grace's words had unsettled him, but they had also saved him. They had reminded him of something priceless. Love, in its simplest form, was worth more than all the billions he had amassed. And for the first time, Richard Donovan understood that being a father was the greatest investment he would ever make. The following weeks marked a transformation in the Donovan household, one that even the walls of the mansion seemed to notice. Richard had once thought of his estate as a monument to his success. Glass chandeliers, polished marble, sweeping staircases, art imported from the far corners of the world. Yet, for all its grandeur, it had always felt cold, lifeless. The kind of home where footsteps echoed too loudly and silence lingered in corners like shadows. Now, for the first time, warmth had begun to seep into those spaces. And it wasn't from the expensive decor. It was from laughter. Emily's laughter, rising like sunlight and filling the halls. It began with small gestures. Richard cleared time from his calendar to have breakfast with Emily each morning. At first, she watched him with wide eyes, as though uncertain he would really stay. But after a few days, when he was still there at the table, waiting with a smile and her favorite pancakes, she began to trust it. She began to trust him. Their conversations were simple: school, dolls, stories she made up about magical kingdoms. But to Richard, they were revelations. He had never realized how bright, imaginative, and full of wonder his daughter was. Each word she spoke was a window into a world he had nearly missed. And Grace, always nearby, always steady, saw the changes too. She watched the way Emily's shoulders straightened with pride whenever Richard praised her drawings. She noticed the way Richard leaned in closer when Emily whispered secrets to him that she once reserved only for Grace. To Grace, it was beautiful to witness, even if it came with a bittersweet pang. She had been Emily's world for so long. And now, slowly, she was stepping aside, letting father and daughter rediscover each other. But the bond didn't grow without awkwardness. One Saturday afternoon, Emily begged Richard to take her to the park. He agreed eagerly, but once they arrived, he felt completely out of place. Other parents chased after toddlers or pushed swings. Richard stood stiffly in his tailored jacket, uncertain of how to act. "Daddy, push me!" Emily squealed from the swing. Richard hesitated, then gave a gentle push, too gentle. Emily groaned, "Harder!" He tried again, this time too hard, sending her soaring into the air with a shriek. Richard panicked, rushing forward. "Are you all right?" Emily laughed so hard she nearly fell off the swing. "That was amazing!" Richard, flustered, rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll get the hang of it." Grace, who had accompanied them at Emily's request, smiled softly from the bench. She could see it, his effort, his clumsy love, his yearning to do right. And for Emily, that effort mattered more than perfection ever could. Gradually, Richard's world began to shift. He started leaving the office earlier. His late-night meetings became fewer. He discovered that there was more satisfaction in reading Emily a bedtime story than in closing another deal. He also began noticing Grace in ways he hadn't before. Not romantically, not yet, but with a deep respect. He saw the way she braided Emily's hair each morning with care. The way she had memorized all of Emily's fears and joys. How she knew which stories calmed her nightmares, which songs made her dance. One evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Richard found Grace tidying up the playroom. "You've done more for her than I ever have," he admitted quietly. Grace looked up, startled. "Sir." "No, please. Let me finish." He stepped into the room, his voice low, sincere. "You gave her what I didn't know how to give. Love, tension, a childhood. And I'll never be able to repay that." Grace hesitated, then said softly, "I didn't give her anything you couldn't. I just had the time. She never stopped needing you, sir. She never stopped waiting." The words struck Richard's heart like an arrow, and he vowed, silently, never to make Emily wait again. As weeks turned into months, their routines solidified into something precious. Mornings were for shared breakfasts, often messy with spilled juice and syrup but filled with chatter and giggles. Afternoons were sometimes spent in the garden, Richard fumbling through Emily's games while Grace watched, smiling. Evenings became sacred for bedtime stories, where Richard discovered he was a surprisingly animated reader, complete with voices that made Emily squeal with delight. Slowly, the mansion no longer felt like an empty monument. Felt like a home. One evening, Emily asked the question that silenced both adults. "Daddy?" she said, her head tilted as she clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit. "If Grace loves me so much, does that make her part of our family?" The room stilled. Grace froze mid-step, her eyes dropping to the floor. Richard looked at his daughter, then at Grace, and something stirred in him. A realization of just how much Grace truly meant, not just to Emily, but to both of them. "Yes," Richard said finally, his voice firm. "Grace is family." Emily's smile was wide and innocent, satisfied with the answer. But Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She bowed her head slightly, whispering, "Thank you, sir." But in her heart, she knew it wasn't about gratitude. It was about recognition. After years of being invisible in the background, she was finally seen. Yet, the growing bond didn't go unnoticed by others. Richard's business associates raised eyebrows when he declined evening meetings. "You're softening," one of them remarked with a laugh. Perhaps he was. But Richard no longer cared. He discovered a strength in love that boardrooms could never teach him. And he began to see Grace as more than just an employee. She was the reason Emily hadn't grown up alone. She was the bridge between what he had failed to give and what he was now learning to offer. The turning point came one rainy Sunday. The three of them sat in the living room, Emily building a tower of blocks while thunder rumbled outside. Without thinking, Emily looked up at them both and said, "We're the best team ever, me, Daddy, and Grace." Richard and Grace exchanged a glance. There was no denying it anymore. Their lives were no longer separate roles of employer and maid, or father and child. They had become a unit, a family forged not by titles, but by love. And for Richard, the realization was both humbling and life-changing. For the first time in his life, he understood that wealth wasn't counted in dollars or properties. It was counted in moments like this. Laughter on a rainy afternoon, a daughter's joy, and the steady presence of someone who had given her heart without asking for anything in return. That bond was priceless, and it was growing stronger every day. The day that Richard Donovan finally understood the true meaning of wealth was not marked by a business deal, a lavish party, or a new acquisition. It came quietly, unexpectedly, in the warmth of his own home. A celebration unlike any other. It was Emily's 7th birthday. In the past, her birthdays had been extravagant events, planned by assistants, decorated by professionals, attended by the children of Richard's wealthy associates. They were polished, impressive, and utterly hollow. Emily had often spent them sitting at the corner of a decorated table, smiling shyly but never truly happy. This year was different. Richard asked Emily what she wanted for her birthday. She thought for a long while, her little brow furrowed, before finally saying, "I just want you and Grace to be there, really be there." And so, there were no rented clowns or towers of glittering cake. No photographers, no endless stream of strangers. Just Richard, Emily, and Grace in the sunlit garden behind the mansion. A homemade cake, baked clumsily by Richard with Grace's guidance, stood on the table, lopsided and imperfect, but Emily declared it was the best cake in the whole world. They decorated the garden with balloons Emily had blown up herself. Richard strung ribbons on the trees, laughing when they tangled in his hair. Grace set up a picnic blanket, spreading out Emily's favorite snacks. When they sang Happy Birthday, Emily's eyes sparkled with joy, and she whispered to Richard, "This is the happiest I've ever been." For the first time, Richard realized something that struck him to the core. The happiness of his daughter required no millions, no glittering banquets. It required his presence, his love. A letter from the past. Later that evening, after Emily had fallen asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, Richard lingered in the study. He opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years and found a letter written by his late wife. Her handwriting was delicate, the ink slightly faded. "Richard, if you are reading this, it means I can no longer be by your side. I worry about Emily. She needs love more than riches. Promise me you will give her your time. Promise me you won't let your success steal her childhood. She needs you more than the world ever will. The words shattered him. For years, he had done the opposite, chasing wealth while neglecting the very promise his wife had begged him to keep. Tears slid down his face as he whispered into the quiet room, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But as he wiped his tears, he knew one thing. It wasn't too late to change. Grace's secret. A few days later, Richard found Grace in the kitchen, humming softly as she packed Emily's lunch for school. He watched her for a long moment before finally saying, "Grace, why did you stay? All these years you could have left. You could have found another job." Grace paused, her hands stilling over the lunchbox. Slowly, she turned toward him. "Because Emily needed me. Because I knew what it was like to grow up without parents. I couldn't let her feel alone. Not when I could help." Her words carried the weight of her own past. A childhood of hardship. A life that had taught her to give where she once lacked. Richard felt his throat tighten. "You've been her mother when she needed one most." Grace shook her head gently.
No.
She already had a mother who loved her. I just kept her mother's love alive. For the first time, Richard saw Grace not as a maid, not even as simply a caretaker, but as the guardian angel who had saved his daughter's spirit. Public choice. Weeks later, Richard was invited to a grand charity gala, the kind of event he once thrived in, the perfect stage to display his influence. This time he brought Emily, and to the surprise of many, he brought Grace as well. Whispers followed them the moment they walked in. A billionaire with his child and his maid? Associates exchanged knowing glances. Some even sneered. But Richard ignored them. When he took the stage to speak, he did something no one expected. "My entire life I believed wealth was measured by what I owned. Properties, companies, numbers in a bank account. But tonight I want to tell you that none of that matters. True wealth is not found in gold or silver. It's found in the people who love you, in the laughter of your child, in the sacrifices of those who stand by you even when you don't deserve it." His gaze shifted toward Grace, who stood humbly near Emily. "This woman you see here, Grace, has given my daughter more than all my riches combined. She gave her joy, love, and stability when I was too blind to see what mattered. For that, I will be forever in her debt. She is family, and I stand here proud to say so." The hall fell silent. For once, no one dared whisper. Some looked moved, others confused, but Richard didn't care. He had spoken his truth. Emily, beaming, clapped her little hands. Grace's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hide them. That night, Richard didn't win admiration for his wealth. He earned respect for his heart. The mansion transformed. Months later, the Donovan mansion was no longer a palace of emptiness. It had transformed into a place of warmth and love. The garden bloomed not just with roses but with laughter. The dining room, once a sterile space of silence, now echoed with shared meals. Emily often declared that the best nights were when Daddy burned the toast and Grace had to save breakfast. Richard's office, once his sanctuary, often had crayon drawings taped to the desk, Emily's masterpieces. Instead of frowning, he framed them. Wealth still surrounded them, but it no longer defined them. What defined them was the bond they had built. A billionaire, a little girl, and the maid who became more than a caretaker. She became the heart that held them together. The final realization. One evening, as Richard tucked Emily into bed, she looked at him with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Daddy, are we rich?" Richard smiled. The old him would have proudly listed their assets, their estates, their power. But now, he simply kissed her forehead and said, "Yes, sweetheart, we're the richest people in the world." Emily smiled, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep. Richard stood there for a long while, watching her chest rise and fall. Then he stepped into the hallway where Grace was waiting. "Grace," he said softly, "you've shown me what wealth really means. It's not about what I own. It's about who I have. You gave Emily love when I didn't. You gave me a chance to be a father again. And that makes you the greatest treasure of all." Grace lowered her gaze, humbled. "I didn't do it for treasure, sir. I did it for love." And for the first time, Richard didn't feel like a billionaire addressing an employee. He felt like a man speaking to someone who had changed his life forever. Epilogue: The Legacy of Love. Years later, people still knew Richard Donovan as a billionaire. But those closest to him knew him for something greater. A man who had found his true wealth not in banks or business, but in the family he built. Emily grew up confident and loved, carrying both her father's strength and Grace's compassion. And Richard never forgot the promise he had once broken, but finally redeemed, to put love above everything else. Because in the end, money fades, businesses crumble, empires fall. But the bonds of love, the laughter of a child, the sacrifice of a caretaker, the warmth of family, are treasures no wealth can ever surpass. That was the true wealth revealed.